President Trump fulfills a campaign promise by withdrawing troops from Syria. 63,000 people have donated over $4 million to a GoFundMe page for Trump's wall. Lastly, CNN's Journalist of the Year amidst making up stories. This is The Better World, and I'm your host, Luis Acevedo. Starting off today, we're going to talk about President Trump's decision to withdraw troops from Syria. So this happened yesterday, Wednesday the 19th, and he said that they would start withdrawing troops immediately from Syria. This was something that he had promised to do ever since he decided to run for president. As a matter of fact, this was something he urged then President Obama not to do when Obama wanted to send troops to Syria. He was against it ever since then. So it should be no surprise to anybody that he is actually fulfilling this promise. So if you remember, back in 2013, Obama made an announcement that he would get congressional approval to take action in Syria due to their government's use of chemical weapons on citizens. A similar situation happened in 2017, last year, and when further investigation was done in 2013 on the first chemical attack, the UN finished their investigation and found that it was not the Syrian government, but the rebels. And there is still no definitive answer as to whether or not it was the Syrian government who did it in 2017. Regardless, President Trump still sent an airstrike on a military base or airfield in Syria as a response to the chemical attack that was used. Now, I think it's important to note that all this chaos in the Middle East has basically culminated the emergence of ISIS. And ISIS gained a foothold in Syria, which has now been diminished significantly since our interference, although we're still over there. And there is debate to be had whether or not ISIS will regain strength in Syria. I don't think they will. I think that our interventions in the Middle East have typically turned out pretty badly for the country we are in. And at that point, with that being said, I actually want to take a trip down memory lane because I think it's important to refresh our memories as we talk about this situation in Syria, and the Middle East is becoming a big talking point once again, and to illustrate why I agree with President Trump's removal of troops in Syria. So, the CIA has a history of orchestrating coups in the Middle East, and they all started for one reason, and one reason only, at least to my knowledge, and that's oil. We go back to 1949. Syria was a democratic state, something I didn't know until very recently. And they had an elected president. This president was hesitant to agree to a trans-Arabian pipeline that was a British-American project. It would go through Saudi Arabia, through Syria, and exit out through Libya. He was hesitant to sign on to this because he wanted to essentially nationalize their oil and keep their reserves for them. The CIA did not like that, although at that time Truman was president and he decided not to intervene. Once Eisenhower got into office, though, things changed. The CIA director, Alan Dulles, decided to engineer a coup to replace the Syrian president with their own hand-picked dictator. Their dictator only lasted 4 months after dismantling parliament and approving the American pipeline project. Not too long after that, in 1955, the Syrian people tried to have a democracy once again. And they re-elected their once ousted president. What happened? Well, I'm sure you can guess it. Another coup was orchestrated by the CIA. And these coups did not stop here. The same thing happened in Iran during a time when they too were a democracy. And they also wanted to nationalize their oil. Both Britain and American governments didn't like that idea. The Iranian president at the time was smart enough to exile all the, force out all the British intelligence officers. Didn't do the same for the American officers because he admired us. He aspired for Iran to be something like us. Well, unfortunately, that turned out to not work for him because the CIA orchestrated another coup. And the Iranian president was overthrown and replaced by another CIA handpicked dictator who paved the way for the Islamic Revolution in 1979. This also happened to Iraq, roughly the same time that it was going on in Iran. Now, there is no definitive evidence to suggest that the CIA played a role in Iraq, although there is definitive evidence to conclude the CIA had active roles in Syria and Iran. In Iraq, it seems to fit the pattern of the CIA. That's why I conclude them in here, because they too were once a democracy with an elected president who wanted to nationalize their oil. When that happened, guess who was one of the people who were in charge of assassinating the Iraqi president at the time? Saddam Hussein. After this failed attempt, he went to Egypt and Syria, came back to Iraq in, I believe, 1963, became an influential person within his own party after serving some jail time because his party took power after the exile of the president, the Democratic president. And after he served his prison time, he then became influential, I believe, in 1963. Then 1965 or 69, I believe, one of the two, he became the dictator in Iraq. And in the 1970s, he decided to try and nationalize his oil, and we all know how that ended for him. He got hung back in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, early 2000s. So after going through this, like you, I thought to myself, there has to be another reason, because it seems pretty unreasonable for the United States to do something like that. That just seems like a power-hungry move, right? I thought the same thing. And there is another reason. It has to do with communism. During this time, we have to remember the Cold War was going on, communism was flourishing. The Soviet Union had a stronghold on the eastern half of the world, starting to further their reach into the Middle East. And we wanted to mitigate that, which is completely reasonable in my estimation. So the reason for not wanting communist influence over American influence had to do with oil, though. Because in the Middle East, almost all industrialized countries at that time, were getting their oil from that region. So whoever controlled the region controlled the oil, therefore has control over the industrialized world, which just goes right back to we wanted to dominate that region over the communist region. That way it would be America in the Western world in charge of distributing the most valuable resource we have, oil. And that takes us all the way to the present. If you recall, I talked about this a while ago, and I also shared it on my social media from Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, that due to Trump's policies on allowing an increase of oil productions here in America, we have actually become the #1 exporter in the world for oil. Why does this matter? Because we now have more influence and power staying right here at home. We don't need to wage wars to gain influence when, guess what? Now we export the most oil in the world. Not the Middle East, not Russia, America. And you'll see in the news that people are strongly disagreeing with President Trump's move. I think there's a couple reasons for that. It, in part, maybe I'm wrong, but in part has to do with an incomplete view of history. After going over everything I just went over, it seems pretty rational to agree with President Trump's move, because every time we intervene in the Middle East, it is just a way for us to further our dominance throughout the world. Not saying that spreading American values is necessarily a bad thing, but it isn't needed in regions that were already developing democratic tendencies. And it wasn't even about that. It was about oil, which we now have here. The other reason I would say people are in bipartisan agreement against, bipartisan agreement against President Trump's removal of troops has to do with the ever-growing military-industrial complex, which oddly enough, Eisenhower, the man who started these coups, gave the CIA a taste of blood, was the one to warn the American people that the military-industrial complex was getting too strong. If this is a little too far-fetched for you to believe, I implore you to do your own research then. I also recommend you look at the Pike and Church testimony or commission that was put together, because in that testimony, they basically stated, if I'm not mistaken, that the CIA was actively trying to manipulate the American people here at home. This is what our own government's doing. And this is what President Trump meant by draining the swamp, getting rid of the deep state. The CIA is part and parcel of the deep state. They don't want to give up their power. They are essentially an autonomous function of not a function, they are an autonomous government. That has been a shadow government for countries in the Middle East for a long, long time. I'm in complete agreement with President Trump's move. I think it was a very good job on his part, and I think that once you have a more broader view of history and understand exactly what took place over the course of the last 100 years, it's pretty self-evident that this is a good move. And bringing our troops home is never a bad thing, especially when we're in regions we have no business being in. Meanwhile, at the home front, something extraordinary is happening. A Purple Heart recipient, Brian Kolfage, who is also a triple amputee, has started a GoFundMe on Sunday. The fundraiser is to raise money for President Trump's wall. As of today, when I checked earlier a couple hours ago, there had been 63,000 plus people who donated over $4 million. This has only been up for not even a week. $4 million in less than a week. In the description on the GoFundMe page, he wrote the following. Like a majority of those American citizens who voted to elect President Donald J. Trump, we voted for him to make America great again. President Trump's main campaign promise was to build the wall. And as he's followed through on just about every promise so far, this wall project needs to be completed still. And that's right. He has followed through on pretty much all of his campaign promises except the most important one, the one that I have harped on for a while now because it's been in the news quite a lot lately, is the wall. We want the wall, Mr. President. We think it's a very good idea. The stats show it will be effective, extremely effective, to reduce illegal immigration, which is something that is hurting our country, as I've talked about yesterday in the last episode. So it is also important to note, I would say, that the Senate has just passed a short-term bill to fund the government through February and is heading to the House next. I add that because, as we know, it seemed as if President Trump was backing off from his strong stance on not coming to an agreement unless the wall is going to be included for the funding of the government next year. Well, it seems, whether it be because of this GoFundMe page and President Trump knowing about it, because the person who put together the GoFundMe page has been in contact with the Trump administration and lawyers to ensure the proceeds are going to go to the Trump administration for the wall. Well, President Trump tweeted out today the following, which signaled that he is not going to sign this if it gets to his desk. It looks that way. He said he's not going to sign anything without perfect border security, which implies it would need to have the wall included, because that's what President Trump sees as a perfect border security, is having that wall, especially since that is such an integral part of his campaign promise, of why he got elected. If he wants to win in 2020, this needs to happen. The removal of troops is awesome. We are seeing Obamacare being dismantled. Awesome. We got tax cuts. Beautiful. He hasn't touched Medicaid and Social Security, which is something he promised, although I do think that he should maybe change his mind on that. That's my opinion, of course. I've talked about this extensively in other episodes. Social Security is only hurting us more than it's helping us. It's supposed to be completely depleted, if I'm not mistaken, by 2030. We're going to be paying more in interest than we do in Medicaid by 2020, if I'm not mistaken, or somewhere around there. In a few years, we'll be paying more in interest than we do in Medicaid. So those things definitely need to be looked at. But he has kept his promise, as in not cutting those. But what really needs to happen is the funding for the wall and for that to be built. So his stance on the tweet, like I said, was, pretty surprising, being that the White House kind of caved in to the Democrats, which, why would they? They were we have more influence right now in power to get the wall done than we will in January. It's as simple as that. So it could have something to do, like I stated, with the GoFundMe page and him realizing that he needs to get this done. And on a side note, I really, really think that this GoFundMe page is an awesome idea, and it should be tried in other aspects of government programs, You could require a certain amount of money to be donated depending on income and enforce it that way. This way, people feel empowered about where their money's going. Not only that, but it will make the government more transparent. If a certain department doesn't receive enough funding, then obviously it's not providing that much value to the American people. I think the government should try to do this. I don't think it's a bad idea. For other things, if you give people the option on what they're going to spend their money on, they're going to obviously support functions of the government, because we need the government. there are certain things we don't need the government to do, which we can weed out if we allow the people in America to decide where they're going to spend their money. I think it's as simple as that. I think it's a good idea to try and make this a universal program within the government. Although I'm not a legislator, I'm just sharing my idea, my thought, my opinion with you guys on that matter. But I think this is, going back to the story, this is a awesome thing that's taking place here. It shows real initiative, and it actually provides the mainstream media with conclusive evidence that the American people really do want this. At least half of them do. The ones who voted for him do. You can't ignore that. You can't. And you can't blame him for wanting to fulfill his campaign promises. His campaign promises, any president's campaign promises, are the reason they get elected. So, in other news, the last topic we're going to be talking about today is CNN's 2014 Journalist of the Year resigns after admitting to falsifying stories, reports the Daily Caller. So the journalist wrote for a German newspaper called Der Spiegel, something like that. It's DERSPIEGEL. I don't know. If my wife was here, she could give you the pronunciation. She took German in college, and she has a Rosetta Stone for German. She's very fascinated by the language. Maybe she'll be able to know. I don't know. Anyway, so he wrote a statement that he falsified articles on a grand scale and even admitted to inventing characters. Inventing characters, anonymous sources. Wink, wink. Yeah, so this dude wrote 60 articles, 14 of which he admits to being falsified. That's nearly 25% of this dude's stories he admitted not to be true. 25%. If nothing else, this hits home. Why? President Trump is 100% correct in his politically incorrect characterization of the media by labeling them the enemy of the people. How can a once trusted, reputable news organization like CNN award somebody who writes fake news 25% of the time? 25% of the time. That's huge. You can't trust them. If they're not willing to verify this guy's stories and actually find out if he is being honest, then how can you trust him? Pure confirmation bias. That's what took place here. And I want to add this. I'm not big on the what ifs, but I think it doesn't take much to realize if this was Fox and they had awarded somebody who ended up falsifying 25% of their stories, the mainstream media would have a field day and work relentlessly to try and dismantle that organization as a whole. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. There's no two ways about it. But we don't live in that world. We're in a world where CNN does it, and it's okay. And you know what? I will give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it could have been an honest mistake. Maybe they didn't do their due diligence. Maybe the German newspaper, I doubt it, but was a reputable place to get their news information from. I don't think so, though. If you have somebody who's writing 25% of the time falsified information, you don't sound very reputable. And it doesn't sound like a reputable news organization would award a journalist who writes 25% fake news reputable either. So that's the news for today. I hope you all enjoyed it, and we will see you again tomorrow. Peace.